1 second, his boots scraped against the wooden floor. The next, only silence remained. That was the last moment anyone saw Thomas Greeley alive. His family swore he was sitting at the head of the table, hands rough from years of working the fields, chewing slowly as his children whispered and laughed at the supper meal. But when his wife turned her head, just for a heartbeat, Thomas was gone. No body, no trace, no sound of a door opening. The chair where he sat rocked gently, as if it had been brushed by something unseen. And here's the chilling part: 6 witnesses, all blood relatives, told the exact same story. They watched their father vanish in plain sight. If that unsettles you, stay with me. Because this isn't just a ghost story whispered around campfires. This is a sworn testimony, filed in 1874, that has haunted New England archives ever since. But here's what no one tells you. The disappearance wasn't the strangest part. What happened after was far darker. Imagine being Thomas's wife, Mary. You're left alone in that farmhouse, staring at an empty chair, and your children are screaming. Mama, Papa's gone. He's gone. How do you even process that? How do you calm them when you're not calm yourself? Hold on to that image for a moment, because if you were in Mary's position, would you think your husband had been taken by something beyond this world? Or would you suspect your own sanity? That's the thin line this family was forced to walk, and it's where this story begins to twist in terrifying ways. Now, I need you to think about something. If you believe ordinary people can't just vanish, you're not alone. Human minds crave explanations. So, naturally, whispers spread through the village. Maybe Thomas ran away. Maybe he staged it. Maybe Mary killed him. But how can 6 children, ages ranging from 9 to 17, all agree on the same impossible detail, that their father faded like smoke, dissolving into nothing before their eyes? Stay with me until the end of this video, because by then, you'll see why this case is considered one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries of its time. And I promise, what you'll hear might make you question reality itself. But let's pull back. Let's step outside that farmhouse and into the surrounding town of Ashford, Massachusetts. A small farming community, tight-knit, religious, and terrified of gossip. The Greeleys weren't outsiders. They were well-respected, hard-working. Thomas was known as a stern but fair man, strong-backed, a farmer who believed in providence. He wasn't the type to run. He wasn't the type to vanish into thin air. And yet, the night after his disappearance, villagers swore they heard his boots echoing in the dirt lanes. Not seen, not touched, just the echo of heavy steps in the silence. Here's where the story fractures. Some say Mary herself claimed to hear those steps pacing outside her window. Others insist it was the children who first told the story, trembling as they clutched their mother's skirts. But in either version, one thing is constant: the sound of boots on the earth, moving without a man inside them. If you're still here watching, I want to pause and ask you, what would you believe? If 6 children and a mother swore a man disappeared, would you think they were liars? Or would you start to wonder if the world hides things science will never explain? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read them, and trust me, your theories help shape which stories I tell next. Now back to the night. After Thomas's disappearance, Mary did something remarkable. Instead of hiding, she summoned the neighbors. She wanted witnesses. She wanted someone else to see what she and her children saw. And that tells us something important. Mary wasn't afraid of gossip. She was afraid of something much worse: being alone in that house when whatever took Thomas decided to return. And when the neighbors entered the farmhouse, one detail struck them cold. Thomas's dinner plate was still half full. The knife and fork rested on either side, as though he'd just paused mid-bite. The food was warm. The candlelight flickered against the rocking chair that hadn't quite steadied. It was as if time had frozen in that moment, except for Thomas himself, who was gone. Here's where we need to jump forward, because this case isn't just about that night. It's about the legacy of what happened next. In the years that followed, people claimed to see Thomas's shadow where he should have been. His eldest son, Peter, swore he woke one night to see his father's outline standing at the foot of his bed. No face, no features, just a black silhouette, staring. And when Peter screamed, The figure dissolved into the wall. Others in town reported the same. Fleeting glimpses of a farmer-shaped shadow, always near windows, always vanishing when confronted. The boots scraped again, always the boots. That sound became a curse in the Greeley household. Every creak of wood, every drag of a heel across the floor made the children panic. And here's the hook you can't ignore. Thomas's disappearance wasn't the only one. Within 3 years, 2 more men in Ashford would vanish under equally bizarre circumstances. No struggle, no body, just sudden, silent absence. If you're thinking this sounds like folklore, ask yourself, why were these cases documented in local newspapers? Why did multiple testimonies survive in archives, preserved with signatures and dates? Folklore doesn't come with sworn affidavits. Fear does. Now, let me rehook you, because I need you to stay with me here. We often ask, how can someone vanish? But maybe the better question is, why? What would take a man like Thomas Greeley in front of his children at his dinner table? Was it punishment? Was it accident? Or was it something darker, something that feeds on witnesses, on fear, on the spectacle of the impossible? This isn't just about one man. This is about the trauma it left behind. His wife, Mary, never remarried. She died in that farmhouse, still staring at the empty chair where Thomas had once sat. Locals said she spoke to it at night, whispering as though he were still there. The children grew into adults marked by paranoia, forever divided between those who swore they'd seen the impossible and those who tried to bury it. And this is why you need to watch until the very end of this video, because I'm going to show you not just how this story was told, but how it was remembered, the way it twisted into something the town of Ashford still refuses to speak of. But for now, return to that dinner table with me. Candles burning low, plates half full, the sound of boots scraping, a gasp, a scream, and then nothing. The silence was so deep it left the children trembling, as if the air itself had been stolen away. That silence is still there, echoing through archives, through testimonies, through history, and maybe through this video, through your screen. You can feel it too. So if this story unsettled you, if you felt a shiver imagining that empty chair, I want you to do 2 things right now. Hit subscribe, because I promise you, this isn't the last time we'll stare into the past and find it staring back at us. And leave me your theory in the comments. What do you think happened to Thomas Greeley that night? Was it supernatural, or something darker within his own family? Your opinion matters here. Together, we're not just retelling forgotten stories, we're digging into mysteries that still demand answers. And if you've watched all the way to this moment, thank you. It means you're not afraid to stare into the silence. The days after Thomas Greeley's disappearance unfolded with a strange rhythm. The farmhouse became a gathering point, not for mourning, but for endless retellings of the moment he vanished. Neighbors sat at the kitchen table, where the family insisted Thomas had been only nights before. The chair remained at the head, pulled out just slightly, as if someone had left it for him to return. Mary wouldn't let anyone move it. The children told the story over and over, their voices trembling each time. They spoke not like children reciting a tale, but like survivors reliving a moment too vivid to forget. Peter, the eldest, always began with the sound of the boots. Anna, the youngest, clung to her mother and whispered about the way the air had shifted, as if someone had sucked all the warmth out of the room. Not everyone believed them. Farmers from nearby fields exchanged glances heavy with suspicion. To them, a man doesn't simply vanish. A man leaves, or he dies. And if he dies, someone knows how. Whispers grew. Was Thomas in debt? Did Mary have reason to be rid of him? Could 6 frightened children have been manipulated into telling the same impossible story? Mary ignored the murmurs, but she knew they clung to her name like soot. She kept the shutters drawn even in daylight. Yet, for all her caution, she couldn't keep the sounds out. At night, the children swore they still heard their father's boots across the floor. Heavy, deliberate steps that circled the table and stopped at the empty chair. One neighbor, Samuel Brewer, recalled being summoned to the house in the early hours of a March morning. Mary had opened the door in her nightgown, candle trembling in her hand. She insisted Samuel stay and listen. The house was still, but then, just as she said, It began, boots dragging across wood, faint but undeniable. Samuel's face drained of color. He sat rigid, his hands clenched, until the sound faded into silence. When he finally left, he told others in the village, "I heard it. He's gone, but he ain't gone." The testimony split the town in two. Some pitied Mary, convinced grief had warped her mind and spread her delusion to the children. Others admitted, quietly, that something unnatural might be at work. Few wanted to take sides publicly. In Ashford, where every reputation was a fragile thread, gossip could ruin a family faster than tragedy. Months passed, and the Greeleys lived in uneasy half-life. The field still needed tending, though Thomas's absence left them struggling. Peter worked where he could, though every ridge of earth he turned seemed to remind him of his father's hands doing the same. Mary began selling small belongings, heirlooms traded for sacks of flour, a copper kettle exchanged for firewood. Then, in late summer, another family found themselves at the center of horror. William Wright, a blacksmith, failed to return home one evening. His apprentice claimed Wright had been hammering at the forge, sweat on his brow, sparks flying with each strike. Then the hammer fell silent. When the apprentice looked, Wright was gone. The hammer lay on the anvil, the metal still glowing orange from heat, but the man who had wielded it had vanished. The apprentice ran into the street, shouting until neighbors crowded around. Some rushed into the workshop, hoping to find Wright collapsed on the floor or hiding in a corner. But he was nowhere. And just like the Greeleys had described months earlier, the air seemed colder, as if the warmth had been pulled away. When word reached Mary, she pressed her lips tight and nodded, as if the world had just confirmed what she already knew. The Wright disappearance unsettled even the staunchest skeptics. Two vanishings in the same small town, both without struggle, both without reason. The whispers turned into dread. Some avoided the Greeleys entirely, as though speaking to them might invite the same fate. Others demanded explanations, sin, curses, unfinished debts to God. The pastor at Ashford's church preached that disappearances were punishments for hidden sins. He urged his congregation to confess, to cleanse their souls before they too were taken. The pews filled with trembling faces, each one searching the shadows for signs of doom. But not everyone believed it was divine. A handful of villagers began connecting details, footsteps, cold air, sudden silence. They claimed the town itself was cursed, that something older than their settlement had been disturbed. A hunting ground, perhaps, an offering gone unpaid. They whispered of shadows that had lived in the forests long before the farms and roads. Mary never joined those conversations. She stayed inside the farmhouse, her face pale, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Yet she seemed to know when the boots would return. The children said she'd go still, her head cocked as though listening, and within minutes the steps would begin again. By winter, sound followed them even beyond the house. Peter claimed he heard it in the fields, pacing behind him in the snow. Anna swore she felt the boards of the schoolhouse floor shudder, as though heavy boots had walked across it, though no one else had seen a thing. The Greeley name became a curse. Farmers who once traded with them now crossed the street. At market, Mary stood alone with her goods unsold. The family was marked, not with proof of guilt, but with the stain of the unexplainable. And then came the third disappearance. In February of 1877, nearly 3 years after Thomas's vanishing, a man named Elias Turner was walking home from the tavern. Snow fell in sheets, muffling sound, but Elias left clear tracks in the fresh powder. A neighbor, looking from her window, saw him pause at the corner of the street. She swore he lifted his arm, as if reaching for someone, or something she could not see. Then, in her words, he folded like smoke. One moment he was standing, the next, his outline blurred, dimmed, and was gone. His tracks in the snow ended where he had stood. The rest of the street lay untouched. That testimony spread like wildfire. Unlike the Greeley or Wright cases, this disappearance had been witnessed by someone with no connection to the victim. The woman repeated her story again and again, her voice shaking but firm. Elias Turner had dissolved in front of her eyes. 3 men, 3 vanishings, each without trace. By then, Ashford was a town sick with fear. Families locked their doors before dusk. Few ventured alone after nightfall, and yet the boots echoed still. In the Greeley household, the children were no longer children. The younger ones grew brittle and anxious, their eyes always darting to corners, to chairs, to shadows. Peter bore the weight of the farm, though his own nights were tormented by the shape at the foot of his bed. He stopped speaking of it aloud. But Mary knew. She always knew. The rocking chair remained at the head of the table, untouched, waiting. Meals were served around it in silence. Plates clinked against forks, but no laughter rose in the room anymore. The chair stood as a reminder and a warning. The town's elders eventually called for an investigation, though no one knew how to begin. Men could search for bodies, yes, but what do you search for when nothing is left behind? Committees met in candlelit rooms, voices raised, fingers pointed. Some demanded the Greeleys be exiled, convinced the family had invited the curse. Others said exile would only spread it, and through it all, the boots scraped on. The investigation into the disappearances began with hesitation, as though no one truly wished to be the one to open the door to answers. A committee of 5 men, elders, farmers, and 1 clergyman, was chosen to interview the families. They visited the Greeley farmhouse first, where the air was heavy with years of silence. Mary received them in her black dress, her hair pinned but untidy. She did not cry. She never did in front of others. She offered no explanations, only the same story she had told dozens of times. Thomas was there, and then he was not. She spoke evenly, as if repeating something she had memorized. The children gave their testimonies too, each with small differences in detail, but all pointing to the same impossible truth. The boots, the rocking chair, the sudden absence. The committee recorded every word, ink scratching against parchment, though the lines of their mouths betrayed their doubts. They did not look at the children long. Next, they questioned the blacksmith's apprentice, who had long since abandoned the forge. His face was hollowed by months of suspicion and whispered accusations. Still, he recounted the night William Wright had disappeared, his voice breaking when he spoke of the hammer lying across the anvil, as if it had fallen from a vanished hand. Finally, they interviewed the neighbor who had seen Elias Turner dissolve in the snow. She remained firmest of all witnesses, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering as she described the man's arm lifting into the night air before his outline folded and was gone. She repeated the description 3 times, unchanged each time. When the committee met afterward, their conclusions split sharply. 2 members insisted the accounts were delusion, fear and hysteria feeding one story into another. One claimed Mary had poisoned her husband and trained the children to protect her secret. Another suggested Wright and Turner had fled debts, using the Greeley tale as a cover. But the 5th member, a gray-haired farmer named Nathaniel Griggs, spoke differently. He reminded the others that the town had been built on land once whispered to be haunted by the native tribes who had lived there before. He told them of stories passed down, of hunters who vanished in the forests, of fires that burned without source. Griggs warned that Ashford was not the first to lose men without explanation. His words carried unease, but no resolution. The committee disbanded, their records stored away in the church, a bundle of parchment bound in twine. No answers, no justice, only silence. As the years crawled on, silence became the town's only defense. People stopped speaking Thomas Greeley's name aloud. Children were warned never to play near the Greeley farm. Even the tavern, where once laughter spilled into the road, grew hushed whenever the vanishings were mentioned. It was as if Ashford had agreed to bury the memory beneath layers of avoidance. But memories do not bury easily. By the late 1870s, the Greeley children had grown into uneasy adulthood. Peter inherited the farm but spoke rarely, his face lined far beyond his years. Neighbors said he carried himself like a man haunted, his eyes always cast toward the fields at dusk. Some whispered he still saw his father in the distance, standing at the edge of the woods, waiting. Anna, the youngest, remained fragile. She married young, though her husband later confessed she would wake in the night, pressing her hands to her ears as if trying to block out footsteps no one else could hear. She bore 2 children, but her own health waned. By 30, she was gaunt and trembling, her eyes shadowed by visions she could not escape. Mary grew older, but never yielded. She lived each day in the farmhouse, always setting a place at the table for Thomas. Visitors reported she would sometimes pause mid-sentence, her gaze shifting to the empty chair, her lips moving as though listening to an unseen reply. She insisted Thomas still came, that he never truly left, only moved into a place she could not reach. By then, Ashford had become a town of superstition. No one traveled alone at night. Candles were left burning in windows until dawn. Some families carved symbols into their doors, hoping to ward off the same fate that had stolen their neighbors. Others whispered that sacrifices might be needed, blood offerings to keep the darkness sated. A farmer's dog was found one morning, tied to a post, its body drained of blood. No one claimed responsibility. The villagers avoided speaking of it, but the fear in their eyes deepened. They could not stop the vanishings, so they turned on each other. Suspicions festered, friendships dissolved. And then, in the winter of 1879, another man disappeared. Jonathan Hale, Cooper, was seen walking along the road near the mill. A group of men stood nearby, tending to a wagon. They swore Jonathan looked their way, lifted a hand in greeting, and then nothing. His body did not fall. His head did not drop. He was simply gone. The snow beneath his boots left smooth, unbroken. The witnesses refused to speak of it openly, but the story crept from house to house, whispered behind closed shutters. For vanishings, all men, all without warning. The town had no more explanations left. By the next spring, families began to leave Ashford. Wagons rolled out at dawn, carrying possessions piled high. The town shrank, its streets quieter with each departure. Those who stayed behind did so out of stubbornness or poverty, or belief that nowhere else could be safer. But they, too, walked the streets with heads down, listening for the scrape of boots that seemed to echo through every corner. Mary remained, rooted to the farmhouse. She refused to abandon the land, claiming Thomas still lingered there. Even as the roof sagged and the paint peeled, she kept the home as it had been the night he vanished. The chair untouched, the table worn but set. By the early 1880s, the vanishing slowed, but the memory never left. Those who had witnessed them carried their silence like a wound. The committee records remained locked in the church, gathering dust, while the town tried to pretend normalcy. But in every household, fear lingered. The idea that a man could vanish without cause, without trace, had settled into the bones of Ashford like rot. And in the farmhouse, Mary waited. She waited until her own breath grew shallow, until her body bent with age. On her final night, the children claimed she sat upright in bed, her eyes fixed on the corner of the room. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Thomas." Then she closed her eyes and was gone. The house was left to her descendants, though none stayed long. Some said the sound of boots never ceased, even as generations passed. Others said the rocking chair at the head of the table continued to sway in empty rooms. Visitors spoke of cold air, sudden silence, and the faint sense of a man's presence standing just behind them. The town shrank, faded, and eventually was absorbed into surrounding villages. But the stories never disappeared. They lingered in archives and whispers, in the memories of families who had once called Ashford home. And always, at the center, was the image of a man rising from his chair at supper, the scrape of his boots on the floor, and the silence that swallowed him whole. The candlelight had long since burned out in the Greeley farmhouse, but neighbors whispered they could still see a faint glow inside on certain nights. Some claimed it came from the dining room, where the family had gathered on that impossible evening. Others said it shone from the barn, as if Thomas himself had returned to tend his animals. Whether superstition or something more, the house seemed to breathe with a life it should not have possessed. Lydia had aged a decade in a matter of months. The sharp features of her face had softened into permanent exhaustion. She moved through the house not as a woman, but as a shadow, repeating the chores of daily survival. When she swept the floor, Her eyes lingered too long on the marks that had been left behind, the faint, trailing scuffs that led nowhere, as though her husband's boots had walked into the void. When she carried a pail of water from the well, she paused halfway up the path, scanning the fields as if expecting to see Thomas emerging over the ridge, shoulders hunched, face streaked with the day's labor. But he never appeared. The children, too, were changed. Sarah, the eldest, had grown distant, her voice carrying an unnatural steadiness whenever she reassured her siblings. James, just 12, carried guilt heavy in his chest, repeating in whispers at night that he should have grabbed his father's hand when the air turned cold. Little Eliza, barely able to articulate what she had witnessed, drew pictures in the dirt of stick figures vanishing into jagged spirals. Neighbors tried to help. They brought bread, offered company, tried to fill the silence. But there was a limit to their compassion. Soon whispers rose. Perhaps Thomas had not vanished at all. Perhaps he had simply walked away, abandoning his family under a guise of mystery. It was easier for some to believe in cowardice than in the unexplainable. The minister of the local church spoke sternly one Sunday, without naming names. There are forces that prey on the weak of faith, he declared. When a man turns from God, he invites shadows into his home. Lydia kept her head low, refusing to let her children see the tears streaming down her cheeks. Faith had been all that kept her together, yet now it was twisted against her. A search of the land yielded nothing new. Dogs had been brought, their noses pressed to the scuffed wooden floor where Thomas had last stood. They sniffed, whined, circled, then sat down in confusion. They could not follow what was not there. The sheriff eventually declared the matter unresolved, writing in his ledger words that gave no comfort. Man presumed missing, whereabouts unknown. But the family knew differently. They had seen. They had heard the scrape of boots, the sudden stillness, the choking silence that had swallowed him whole. They had lived with it every moment since. Time passed. The farm began to wither. Crops that had once flourished under Thomas's care faltered. Animals grew restless, some breaking through fences as if fleeing an unseen predator. At night, strange sounds crept across the fields. Not the howl of coyotes, not the creak of branches, but a low, sustained hum, like wind pressing against the earth itself. Lydia tried to keep her children inside after sundown, but James once slipped out, convinced he had seen his father's silhouette moving near the barn. He returned pale and shaking, muttering about a figure that turned its head without eyes. By the second year, the Greeley farm had become a place of dread in the county. Travelers avoided the road that passed by its fields. Mail was delivered hastily, left at the edge of the property. Even those who had once been closest to the family now spoke of them only in hushed tones. Rumors spread like infection. Thomas had been taken by witchcraft. He had made a pact. He had been punished by God. Or worse, he still lingered, trapped between worlds, waiting to claim another. One night in early autumn, Sarah was awoken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Her heart froze. She knew the steps. She had known them her whole life. They were her father's. She lay rigid in bed, the boards beneath her vibrating softly with each impact. The footsteps paused outside her door, lingered, then moved away. The next morning, when she confided to her mother what she had heard, Lydia said nothing. She only stared at the floor, her hands trembling around a chipped teacup. Other incidents followed. Eliza screamed one night that she had seen her father's reflection in the window pane, staring in from the darkness though the shutters were closed. James claimed to hear a muffled voice calling his name from the fields. Lydia, washing clothes by the creek, once swore she felt a hand on her shoulder, strong and familiar, though she was alone. Yet no matter how real these moments felt, they ended the same, with emptiness. No proof, no body, no return, just silence. Years wore on, and the Greeleys became bound to the mystery. Their lives were no longer measured by seasons or harvests, but by each strange occurrence, each moment when the boundary between absence and presence seemed to thin. They lived in waiting, suspended in a grief that never allowed closure. Some say Lydia herself began to change, her eyes darkening, her voice gaining a hollow resonance. Visitors remarked that she often spoke as though Thomas were still in the room, pausing to let him finish a sentence that no one else could hear. The children grew older, but the shadow of that night never lifted from them. They carried it into adulthood like an inherited curse. In later years, when outsiders passed through the county, they heard the tale of the farmer who had vanished in front of his family's eyes. Some dismissed it as folklore, a story invented to explain an abandonment or to scare children into obedience. Others leaned closer to the fire, asking for every detail, craving the terror of it. But those who had lived nearest, those who had once shared bread with Thomas, shook their heads. "We don't talk about that house," they would mutter. "Best to leave it to the silence." The farmhouse eventually collapsed into ruin. The roof caved first, then the walls, until only the stone foundation remained, choked with weeds. But even in decay, people swore it was not truly empty. On still nights, they said, if one stood by the remnants of the dining room, they could hear it. The scrape of boots across the floorboards, followed by a silence so deep it pressed against the chest, stealing the breath from the lungs. Generations later, the story of Thomas Greeley endured, not in court records or official ledgers, but in whispers, in fireside retellings, in the cautious steps of those who refused to walk the road after dark. His name became less important than the act itself. A man present one moment, gone the next, swallowed not by distance, but by nothingness. And so the mystery remained, unsolved, unyielding. A family broken, a community scarred, a silence that stretched beyond the walls of a single farmhouse to haunt an entire county. What happened in that room, in that instant where boots scraped wood and time itself seemed to falter, was never answered. Perhaps it was never meant to be, because sometimes the most terrifying thing is not what we discover, but what is taken from us, leaving only silence in its place.